Please join me in welcoming Mitchell J. Landrieu.
Thank you, Dr. Lori. I really appreciate it. Thank everybody for joining us today. And I'm really excited about partnering with Brookings. And of course, want to thank the Emerson Collective for being our funder and partner throughout this work that Pluribus Unum is doing. And thank all of you for taking the time to be with us during this very critical and difficult time for our country. I want to take a minute to acknowledge the moment that we're in with the massive economic crisis that we're facing, the health crisis that we're facing, and of course, the issue that is confounding this nation from its beginning until today, and in a passionate way on the streets of our country. I have said many times that race is this nation's most traumatic issue. The events of the past weeks have laid bare the divisions we seek to heal and the consequences of systemic racism that we seek to correct at Pluribus Unum. I said many times, we all go on our own journey on race, and our team at Pluribus Unum has compiled books to read, movies to watch, people to follow, and more that helped inform our views on race or challenged us to think differently and pointed out where we were wrong. We should all use this as a listening and learning moment, but the truth is we do not have a deficit of ideas in this country. In my opinion, and in the opinion of EPU, we have a deficit of courage. For all the government and civic leaders we have with us, we have to accept responsibility for changing and acting on these newfound perspectives, and we can't wait. The world has grown impatient for change. When Dr. King wrote the letter from Birmingham back in 1963, he said, "This wait almost always means never," and how true that is. And so I'm especially issuing a call to local leaders who control so much of our criminal justice system, our local procurement laws, education laws, taxing structure, housing and zoning codes. Now is a time for us to reconstruct our governmental systems. We know that we are divided by design, and so now we have to redesign them if we want a different outcome. Today's important conversation is on the steps that local leaders and their private sector partners can take to support an equitable recovery for small, women, and Black-owned businesses in the wake of COVID-19 and everything else. We know that these businesses serve as the lifeblood of cities and towns all over the country, and it is critical to find and advance innovative solutions to ensure that these vital businesses don't close their doors and can flourish in a post-COVID world. I spent a lot of time as mayor thinking about how we create a pathway to prosperity for these small businesses and DBEs. It takes intentional work and support, especially after Katrina. We had to think about rebuilding the economy back better than it was before, not how it was. In our desire to support local leaders that face a long road ahead in leading the economic recovery resulting from the pandemic, EPU wanted to create opportunities to elevate an exchange of ideas on strategies to address this critical issue. And this conversation today will be the first in a series designed in our partnership with Brookings. Finally, key focus of our work at EPU is to support courageous leaders who are committed to strengthening their communities and are working in creative ways to address racial and economic equity in their communities. One way we will do this is through the Unum Fellows Program, a leadership accelerator for Southern local elected officials. We will be launching this application for that program on June 15th. Well, enough from me. I want to thank our partners at Brookings. Today, we will hear from Joe Perilla, Brookings scholar, who will lead our conversation and a panel discussion today. Pam Lewis, Executive Director, New Economy Initiative in Detroit, and Kendra Key, Senior Vice President of Community and Economic Development with Hope in Birmingham. Thank you all so much for being with us, and thank you for the participants. I will now turn it over to Joe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor, and to your team for inviting us in to partner on your work and for inviting me personally to be a part of this event. As the mayor said, I am at the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, which is one of 5 programs at Brookings. We're focused on the health and vitality of America's cities and regions. And I think local leaders are finding themselves on the front lines of the 3 crises that the mayor outlined. So what I wanted to do today was to offer some framing remarks, go through a little bit of the data that we've been looking at related to the small business crisis, and then turn it over to 2 colleagues that I have a great respect for, Pam and Kendra, who are going to talk about the strategies that they're pursuing in their communities. We will open it up then to some Q&A. And so for the participants, if you have questions or reflections as the discussion unfolds, please use the Q&A button to share those, and we'll address them in the discussion. So hopefully folks can see that. Really, I think to set the context for this, given the title of this webinar, we really wanted to do three things. One was to look at Main Street businesses in particular. The first part of the title is the future of Main Street. And I want to spend a little bit of time defining those businesses, their unique position. Second, there is I think, lack of awareness of the demographics of business ownership in the United States, not necessarily among this group, but in the broader public arena. And so I want to show some disturbing statistics about that. And then third, COVID is a unique crisis in that it is hitting Main Street and it's hitting communities of color disproportionately. And so I think we want to reflect on that intersection before talking about some potential solutions. So first, what are Main Street businesses? When we say Main Street, I think we think of almost like a physical location, a corridor. But it also is a placeholder for small businesses in general. Using a typology advanced by some folks at Harvard, we can actually segment different types of small businesses. And Main Street, which are within traditional consumer-facing goods and services, they are locally serving, and that segment of the economy employs, pre-COVID, about 43 million Americans, heavily dominated by retail and restaurants. And I lay out this schematic because I think for any sort of solution and response locally, it's important to understand the diversity of businesses, kind of what their starting point was, what their growth opportunities are, what their liquidity challenges are. And so Main Street businesses are unique in that they are directly consumer facing. They're typically pretty small, and they play this really special role in anchoring our communities, our business corridors, and they provide amenities to our cities, and in some ways make them unique and make them great. The second point, after we've defined Main Street, I think, is to acknowledge that small business and business ownership in general in the United States cannot be separated from the broader systemic racial inequities that plague every system. So one way to look at this is to simply look at the share of different demographic groups that own businesses divided by their share of the adult population. And that creates what we call a disparity ratio. So people of color in the United States are about 20% of the adult population. I'm sorry, about 20%. They own about 20% of small businesses, but they're 37% of the adult population. So 20 divided by 37 is 54%. So you can kind of say people of color own about half as many small businesses as they should, given if they had their fair share. That inequity ramps up dramatically for Black Americans. So African Americans own about 2% of businesses. They're about 12% of the adult population, for a disparity ratio of 17%. So African Americans own about 17% of their fair share of businesses. Women, it's about 2/3 of their fair share. I say all this because it's important to acknowledge that these disparities are not a reflection of the entrepreneurial abilities or the interests of these groups. They are a reflection of disparities in educational attainment, personal wealth, access to capital. Basically, the economic systems that have been constructed in the United States do not serve or were not developed in a way that serve people of color in the same way that they do whites. And that historical discrimination persists today. and is shown through these statistics. That said, going back to the Main Street economy, within those nearly 3 million businesses that constitute the Main Street economy, that is a more diverse economy in terms of business ownership than the economy overall. So women, people of color in particular, have owned higher shares of Main Street businesses than they do businesses overall. They still are not at their fair share. I split out African-American business owners because Main Street does not appear to be as strong a foothold for that group in the way it is, I think, for Hispanic and Asian Americans. And if you look at how these ratios are changing over time, our sense is that as the country diversifies, the business ownership will diversify along with it. And that seems to be occurring within Main Street. So the blue line basically is saying that in 2007, people of color owned about 67% of their fair share of Main Street businesses. That's up to 71%. But you look across some of these other segments of the economy and those shares are actually going down. So in manufacturing in particular, you're seeing pretty drastic declines in these disparity ratios. And so I think that certain segments of the economy are kind of inherently more inclusive, it seems, in terms of business ownership, and yet most of these sectors are either stagnant or declining, with Main Street being an important exception. So this is, decades that have resulted in what I would consider to be a long-standing structural crisis in business ownership that results in a less competitive and less dynamic U.S. economy, because if you were to correct for some of these disparity ratios, it would result in millions of additional businesses. So we already had millions of missing businesses due to some of these structural inequities. COVID hit in March and April. And so what this schematic looks like is how the different parts of the economy that I showed in the first slide, on one axis, what their change in employment was in March and April. So Main Street and traded services had the steepest employment drops during those 2 months, with Main Street taking kind of the biggest hit, about 25% decline in employment. And on the other axis, we're looking at the share of businesses in those segments that received loans through the Paycheck Protection Program, which was Congress's CARES Act response to the small business liquidity crisis. And even though Main Street businesses were hit harder, they are not seeing receipt rates at the level of manufacturing companies or healthcare companies, which suggests that there is still liquidity that needs to flow from that program to Main Street businesses. Even though over the course of the last 2 months, you have seen more and more businesses who need those loans get those loans. Still not there yet in terms of that really important national priority. And I think one of the reasons that you're seeing, perhaps initially especially fewer loans through the Paycheck Protection Program going to Main Street businesses were that those businesses, may be unbanked or underbanked, and the Paycheck Protection Program, to achieve scale and rapidity, partnered with a diverse range of financial institutions, but principally larger financial institutions and banks. That was their chosen distribution channel. But that distribution channel has inequitable access. So we know, according to the latest small business survey, that banks are much more likely to lend to white small business owners. So about 46% of white small business owners obtained a loan from a bank in the last 5 years. That's 32% for Latinos, 23% for African Americans. That pattern reverses in terms of online lenders. So African Americans, Latinos have higher rates of liquidity or lending from online lending platforms than they do from banks. And so online lenders did eventually get access to the program, but to the Paycheck Protection Program, but it came later than the bank. So I think you've seen this lag in terms of how that program has delivered for these smaller Main Street businesses. And the unfortunate challenge there is that those are the businesses that had the shortest cash buffers. They had the least, the kind of most acute liquidity challenges. And so they were almost the businesses that you wanted to go support first, which is why to transition, why a couple of things are really needed in terms of policy implications. One is that we need to ensure that PPP is more flexible and more accessible. The good news is that Congress passed legislation to do that. But second, I think there's a very important local role that I'm just going to lay out a couple of points here around technical assistance for the Paycheck Protection Program, helping small businesses with technical assistance services to be more resilient and adaptive and to improve the quality of the jobs that they have. And then some very specific policies, I think, to attack these disparity ratios. And so with that, I'm going to introduce Pam Lewis, because I think Pam is someone that I've learned so much on these issues from. And she has led an effort through the New Economy Initiative, which she directs, which is a special project of the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan. It's a philanthropic-led entrepreneurial development initiative that has deployed since 2007 over 100 million in grants to support the small business ecosystem, and has been a central player in the wake of COVID. So with that, Pam Lewis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Joe, thank you, and Mayor Landrieu, thank you all for having me here and representing Detroit. I know everybody's heard the Detroit versus everybody motto. I'm changing that to Detroit with everybody motto, because we're all in this together. And Joe, thank you for the definition of, talking about this definition of small businesses, because when we started focusing on how do we continue to support the small businesses in Detroit around this COVID crisis, that was the first thing a lot of us talked about. And let me just frame it for you. So in Detroit, if you look at the US Census data, there's 62,000 reported small businesses. 82% of them are minority led, and actually 79% of them are Black owned. Now stick with me, because 90% of the Black owned businesses are actually under 3 employees. And then when you start to layer on what is a Main Street business, and are you talking about businesses with physical locations, these numbers start to drop incredibly. For example, of the Black businesses that are in Detroit, there's about 48,000 of them that are reported as Black businesses in Detroit. When you start getting at which of those actually have more than 4 employees, that number drops down to 1,000. So when you talk about how do businesses get help in this crisis and which businesses are we talking about, we had to be careful that we weren't drawing lines in such a way where we were completely eliminating minority-owned businesses, especially the Black-owned businesses, because they hold such a large share of the businesses in Detroit. So with that context, for those of us who've been primarily on the nonprofit and philanthropic sector side, there's been an initiative to support small businesses in Detroit for about 6 years. We knew the federal dollars would not be touching a lot of Detroit businesses. You could look at the history of SBA, in terms of how those monies are spent, who they're going to. You could look at the lack of SBA lending that's happened in the state of Michigan. And so we began to activate these special stabilization grant programs that were focused on lower income entrepreneurs. And we focused on businesses that were under 10 and entrepreneurs that were 80% of the average median income. We also, instead of just doing capital relief, because we knew the federal dollars weren't necessarily going to hit, because a lot of these businesses have absolutely no relationship with a commercial bank. They rely on grants, CDFI dollars, or even small business competitions and friends and family. And in addition to the stabilization grant program, we started doing loan relief and rent relief. We worked with our CDFIs and our grantees who are lenders, and raise grant dollars to buy down 6 months of loans so that the 260 borrowers of those organizations wouldn't have to worry about paying on those loans through September. And then there was a lot of work that instead of just giving capital and loan relief, there was rent relief as well as technical assistance. How do we begin to activate more technical assistance so that people can understand the cash flow and accounting, the marketing, the HR to bring employees back, the things that they need in order to position themselves to reopen. And this was an effort that was really driven by philanthropy. We have the benefit of a lot of active foundations in Detroit, but it was also the city and the state. Philanthropy through New Economy Initiative brought about $6 billion that touched 2,000 businesses through these programs that I described. And then the state through the local development office, economic development office through our Detroit Economic Growth Corporation that sits within the city, activated another $4 million touching more businesses. And we feel like we were able to do this for a couple of reasons. One, there is a group of organizations, we call them business support organizations, whether they are business TA providers, CDFIs, entrepreneurial training and education centers, that were able to really innovate and activate to create the interventions that I described that we could deploy these $10 million to across about 2,500 businesses. And then there was also swift action on the state where they distributed $10 million in grant dollars to the local EDOs. Detroit received about 1.6 of those distributed through the city of Detroit and Wayne County. And then the mayor, through his leadership, was able to work with city council to release some of our casino loan funds. And so these things were used, plus other dollars that were traditionally for small business competition programs, were used to be deployed to small businesses. So, these are some of the things that we were able to do to provide this relief, this immediate relief. What we're thinking about now, though, is, now we're at a point where the economy is starting to reopen. The governor's Safe Start program is in play. And we want to make sure, like the mayor mentioned earlier, how do we make sure that businesses are able to open, stabilize enough to open, and then be able to operate in the new normal. And so we've taken our philanthropic and nonprofit efforts and have joined them with the mayor's office, as well as the Michigan Economic Development Corporation and private sector leaders, and created a coalition that we call Detroit Means Business Initiative. And this is the first time, actually, I've been in this work for 10 years with the New Economy Initiative. And this is the first time that I've seen the private, public, nonprofit, and philanthropic sectors actually sit down at the same table, focusing on vulnerable small businesses. They did it, focusing on Amazon headquarters, but they had not done it before focusing on businesses. And it was important when this group came together, back to the definition. Small businesses are defined up to 500, but who exactly are we talking about? And we drew a line at 50 employees and under. We drew a line at really trying to weigh out, are we going to focus on those that actually have physical storefronts? What are we going to do about sole proprietors? And how can we develop initiatives that are dealing with people that have businesses and may be seen as having 2 or 3 employees, but in fact, they have a workforce that's using a 1099 model. And so they're not showing up as traditional employees. And this coalition has been focused on what are some of the ways that we can activate additional financial assistance now that the second round of the Paycheck Protection program came forward. How are we working with our community banks, with Huntington Bank and others, to make sure that there's better access points for our small businesses. And then we built more of a robust technical assistance program that involves accounting, legal, HR professionals that are volunteering their time. And then there's a contact center and a website that was designed probably within 5 days where businesses can go and identify these resources. And then some of our corporate partners like DTE Energy put together thousands of PPE kits for business and reopening playbooks, so that businesses could download these playbooks and pick up free PPE kits. And so this effort alone that's been probably active for maybe 3 weeks now, maybe 2.5, we've seen 13,000 visitors to the site. There's been 3,000 downloads of the reopening playbooks. There's been 4,000 personal protection equipment, protective equipment kits distributed, and over 4,000 inquiries through the call center with information pushed out to businesses on a regular basis by partnerships that we've developed with our community development organizations, our membership associations, our ethnic chambers, et cetera. And so this has been, I'll stop there, but we're also learning about the needs. We've had a chance to talk to 72 businesses directly, because we know the needs we thought we knew, before COVID are changing. And what we're hearing is, capital, 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 but what kind of capital? Working capital, capital to buy equipment, capital to make sure they can pay back receivables, cover receivables, pay back accounts payable, to retool and train employees to come back. Still a lot of need for PPE access that's affordable. And then people really want it to, there's so much information, having a trusted and vetted place to go get information regarding guidelines and reopening. And also the city has worked really hard to accelerate some of the permitting practices, so that as the restaurants open up, how can we activate outdoor patio seating that took a little bit of hoops to jump through prior, but they're accelerating that so that that can be activated quickly. So these are some of the things that we're learning, and I'm going to stop there. But just again, happy to share this with you, and happy to be with partners and to talk to people that are feeling and experiencing some of the same things we're doing in Detroit. This is a big subject. It's a big issue. And as the mayor mentioned, when you talk about the health crisis that led to an economic crisis, and now layered on with the exacerbation of the race issue that's always been a part of this country, it's a very trying time. But the thing that I'll leave you with is, I've never seen this level of collaboration in our city, particularly where the private sector, public sector, and philanthropy is sitting at the same table, focusing on the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Pam. And yeah, I'm trying to hold a couple thoughts in our head, just what you said about the incredible challenges that local communities are confronting, but they do seem to be creating new partnerships. The question is kind of what kind of impact they can have. Along those lines, I think, I've introduced Kendra Key, who is based in Birmingham, Alabama. She's a senior vice president of community and economic development at HOPE, which is a regional financial institution that works across the South. And she's really been integral in partnering with the city on delivering on something called Birmingham Strong, that in the spirit of these partnerships is a really interesting one. So thanks, Kendra, for being here.
Thank you. And thank you all for participating in this webinar. HOPE, as Joe mentioned, does provide financial services, aggregates resources, and engages in advocacy to mitigate the extent to which factors such as race, gender, birthplace, and wealth limit one's ability to prosper. Since 1994, HOPE has generated more than $2.5 billion in financing that has benefited more than 1.5 million people in Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee. I'd like to start our conversation with some highlights of HOPE's work around the SBA Paycheck Protection Program. HOPE was a PPP lender in round 1 and round 2, though the vast majority of our lending has occurred in round 2. Since the start of this program, HOPE has closed about 1,400 loans for $68 million. The average loan size is $48,428. The median is $11,000. To put our average loan size into contrast, the national average for all PPP loans is $115,503. And that information is as of May the 23rd. So what do these small loans look like? In Birmingham, Alabama, where I live and work, HOPE made a loan to an organization called Bundles of Hope. And this is a nonprofit organization that provides diapers and feminine hygiene products to low-income women and they reached out for a loan in the amount of $7,625. When the organization applied at their primary bank, they were told that the bank was only serving existing customers with loan requests over $10,000. A similar story can be found in New Orleans. There was a Black-owned barbershop that turned to Hope when no one at one of the largest banks in America would assist him. He applied for a $7,200 loan that was funded by Hope. Without the loan, unable to cover expenses, he would have likely lost his shop that was in business for 27 years. These stats and these stories are obviously inspiring to all of us that engage in this work, but they also underscore the importance of community development financial institutions, or CDFIs. And really, there are 3 points that underscore this premise. First, CDFIs meet people where they are. Large banks, traditional financial institutions aren't set up and frankly won't assist small business borrowers with whom they don't already have an existing relationship, and sometimes even when they do have an existing relationship. Second, CDFIs rarely work alone. We build bridges, and the theme of the call so far has been partnerships. And there are 2 partnerships that greatly expanded Hope's reach into communities with the PPP program that I'll highlight. The first is Birmingham Strong. So Birmingham Strong, which is actually called BHAM Strong, is a public-private partnership with a mission to build, link, and coordinate resources to strengthen Birmingham's COVID-19 response. The city of Birmingham is one of the partners in the partnership, and they recognize that a lot of small businesses in the Birmingham community were being shut out of the PPP process. Some because they did not have an existing relationship with a PPP lender, others because their financial institutions with which they did have a relationship were limiting applications that could be submitted, or ran out of money very quickly. Through the partnership, BHAM Strong lent 3 Birmingham Service Corps members to Hope Credit Union to serve as technical assistance providers for borrowers seeking PPP funds. So we partnered with the City of Birmingham, BHAM Strong, and Goldman Sachs to make loans to small business owners who did not have to be members of Hope. A lot of them had questions about the documentation that was required, what would meet the requirements. And so the Birmingham Service Corps members would go back and forth with the borrower saying, this can be accepted, this is not accepted. And it really helped us to be able to approve loans that probably would not have been approved if they had been submitted through a portal with no human contact. The second partnership that I'll elevate for this group was with the City of New Orleans. New Orleans has a vibrant sector of nonprofit technical assistance providers that was built up after Hurricane Katrina. The City of New Orleans and Hope entered into a partnership with 14 nonprofit technical assistance providers to support entrepreneurs with the development of their PPP applications. The impact of the partnerships has shown. Over a quarter of all Hope's loan applications for the PPP loan came from these 2 cities. The third thing that I'll raise here is that CDFIs import resources. We could not have done this work without our partnership with Goldman Sachs. Goldman provided liquidity to the tune of $75 million and a subsidy for us to do this work. This brought capital into capital-starved communities and covered Hope's costs for making a lot of very small loans. We have made PPP loans for amounts that range from $500 to multiple millions of dollars. So these are high-impact, mission-based loans still, even in the confines of the PPP program. To put this into perspective, we've calculated, based on the SBA PPP fee structure, that the break-even for a PPP loan is roughly $50,000. 90% of Hope's PPP loans are less than $50,000. CDFIs bring all these elements together, and in their absence, the most vulnerable small businesses do not get served. Businesses run by women don't get served, and Black-owned businesses don't get served. The Washington Post reports that we've lost 450,000 Black businesses since the pandemic, a large swath of which were sole proprietorships. The economic impacts of this magnitude will not be relegated to Black neighborhoods and communities. Impacts of this size affect all of us. And so it's important for this group to know that CDFIs matter. So briefly, what else needs to be done? As Joe mentioned, the PPP program is not perfect. Congress will be passing another round of PPP enhancements this week. In our experience, there will be several elements that are missing. One, streamlined loan forgiveness on loans less than $100,000. Current guidelines are too onerous for very small businesses. I've had small businesses say, you know, for $800, I'm really not willing to do the record keeping that's necessary for me to make use of the PPP program. By streamlining loan forgiveness procedures for vulnerable small businesses, more will take advantage of the program, and participating owners will have more resources to invest back into the business. A minimum fee of $2,500 would be critical to ensure CDFIs and other lenders can make loans to smaller businesses who are hardest hit and most financially fragile. 24 weeks to deploy the PPP funds. The timeline, impact, and effects of the pandemic have varied across the nation. Businesses need more time and flexibility to expend PPP loan proceeds. And lastly, we need Congress to fund an emergency appropriation for CDFIs of $1 billion to make sure that the most vulnerable small businesses can continue to get the capital and technical assistance needed to survive. So I'll stop there and look forward to continuing the conversation with those of you on the call.
Thank you, Kendra. I will want to remind participants that if you have a question for myself or Kendra or Pamela, please use the Q&A function, and we're happy to answer those. I think one follow-up I have, for both of you while others are getting their questions together is, in addition to the federal policy changes, which Kendra, I appreciate the precision of those recommendations. As you think about these kind of local coalitions that have been forged, say, in the fires of the worst of the crisis, right? And Pam noted that at least in Detroit, that was new. How do you sustain that? So what does, your respective partnerships look like, say, over the next 18 months? And are the resources there to continue to invest in the institutions that are going to meet the types of businesses that you serve and are most vulnerable, not just in the immediate term when we're kind of risking this extinction level event, but through what is probably going to be kind of this off and on rocky recovery, and how do you keep people focused on this, and how do you importantly keep the resources going? So I'm just curious how Detroit Means Business is structured, like what kind of resources do you expect to come from that, how decisions are being made, and then similar for how you see Birmingham Strong evolving, Kendra.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, Detroit Means Business, like I said, is this new initiative, and we have probably, it's very heavily layered. There's a principals group that is made up of CEOs of our utility, DTE Energy, Blue Cross Blue Shield. We have, of course, Dan Gilbert's organization at that table, along with JP Morgan Chase. And then there's philanthropic leaders, the foundations that are more heavily invested in small business growth development, and a number of the key nonprofits that are actually the practitioners on the ground doing the work. So our CDFI, Invest Detroit, is a leader at that table, along with TechTown, which is a big technical assistance provider. And then we've also looped in Huntington Bank and others. And the conversation we're having now, we've been at this now for about 4 weeks. There's a lot of volunteering happening with, the website was developed because a young company called Vector Forum did it pro bono, right? But we all know this is something that we have to continue. On the philanthropic nonprofit side, this whole network small business ecosystem has been formed, but it has to retool itself in order to understand the new needs, and we're welcoming the additional thinking. The experts that have been working with us have said, let's assume that the cases will drop. There may be a short resurgence, and then you talk about how do we get back to pre-COVID GDP levels. This could be a 24-month, or a little bit longer path. And so now we're starting to frame, well, what does that look like as it relates to this initiative, the Detroit Means Business program elements, and also those that are providing volunteering services and capacity right now. How do you cost that out? Right now, we're looking at, this is something that is probably in the range of $15 million to $18 million. but it still is requiring a lot of philanthropic. It's going to require tons of philanthropic support, as well as trying to determine, are there other uses of CDBG dollars? Are there other uses of state dollars that typically go to tourism that could be directed toward this? And how does that get applied in Detroit and other low-income cities around the state? But these are some of the things that we're thinking about. Happy to report back later once we figure it out.
That's great. And same question to you, Kendra.
So the great thing about BHAM Strong is it is a responsive vehicle. So it'll continue to bend and respond to whatever the needs of the day are. So we had a little bit of violence in our Birmingham community after some rioting, and they have been working on ways to be responsive to that crisis. And so I'm optimistic that the supporters of BHAM Strong will continue to invest in initiatives that will be responsive in the community. I read an article yesterday that said that there was about $120 billion worth of PPP funds left. It's been interesting in this second round, we've seen the pot go up and down almost at the same time. So it's been fun. And so the good thing is that means that there's still PPP money available, and we don't know, what additional resources will be made available, but there's still time for businesses to get their paperwork together and apply. And as long as, PPP money is available, Hope will partner with BHAM Strong to facilitate the making of PPP loans until the federal pot is exhausted. Additionally, there's CARES Act money that municipalities and counties have access to in states. And so Hope was instrumental in having conversations in Mississippi that we're now starting to have in Alabama about, what are some loan funds that can be set up to support businesses. And, we look forward to seeing what the fruits of those conversations will be in the months to come.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank Joe, Pam, and Kendra. My name is Roxanne Franklin-Lorio, and I serve as the Director of Programs for Pluribus Unum. We have set some time aside to answer questions submitted in advance and also submitted through the Q&A function, and we'll take the opportunity now to dig into some of them. So thank you to those that have submitted questions. We have a question from the Q&A that I will pose to any of you in the group to answer. Have you seen cities make it easier for small, local, women, and person of color owned businesses to contract with the city as a recovery strategy? And if so, how specifically?
I'll take that question. We haven't seen that specifically yet. I can back up and talk about what the city was working on prior to COVID. I think the focus right now has been, I call it the fire. There's been so much focus on putting the fire out and ensuring that there are businesses that are surviving this epidemic. But there's a procurement program that was actually focused not just on procuring with the city, but a partnership of about 15 large corporations that are anchor corporations in the city. So think of your healthcare, Detroit Medical Center, Henry Ford Health System, Blue Cross Blue Shield, et cetera. And there was an agreement among them to work with the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation to procure with these small businesses. And the DEGC had the responsibility of identifying these small businesses, doing the matchmaking and providing the technical assistance so that these businesses were equipped to provide the service. This was anything as simple as a local bakery providing hamburger buns to the hospital, to cleaning supplies, et cetera. So it was really beyond the city procurement. They expanded it to a partnership with the businesses. This has not been, the focus has not been on that right now, just to be very honest. But there are conversations about how to reactivate that at the proper time.
Excellent, thank you. We have another question for the group. What metrics and benchmarks should cities be looking at to measure their local economy's recovery?
I can take a shot at that. So, our sense is that, for this recovery to be different than the past, say, 3 recoveries. So every recovery from a recession, I think over the last 3, has both been longer in terms of its duration and more unequal in terms of its disparity. So I think, I kind of start with those two, duration and disparity. I think we want to try to cut this as quickly as possible, in the sense that, it took a decade for the Birmingham region, for instance, to recover the jobs that it lost during the Great Recession. And we cannot repeat that as a country. So I think looking at things, like, how young firms, how businesses are being resilient, are they able to, as they emerge from this kind of frozen period, are they able to rehire? Are they able to be resilient? So I look at some of the statistics around, job growth at small businesses. But on that second part, I think that the disparity part is related to the duration part. I think those two are interconnected. And honestly, up until a release last week, we didn't have a great sense on this small business ownership topic, who owned what. It was kind of incredible that we couldn't tell you how many Black-owned businesses there always were. Like, local communities maybe knew it, but we didn't have great national data at the local level that was standardized. We do now. So every year we can see how the demographics of business ownership evolve. So within this arena, say entrepreneurship, small business resilience, I think you want to look at both those things: overall job growth, but then where, who owns those businesses, and then where those businesses are located in terms of, are they in low to moderate income neighborhoods, in communities of color. And then more broadly than that, there's things like, wages and incomes and the distribution of those across different demographic groups. But for this issue area, I think we actually have better data now to be able to measure what hopefully is a relatively robust recovery period over the next 24 months.
Thank you, Joe. Pam or Kendra, did you have anything you wanted to add to Joe's response?
I was just going to add, there's also an in-process metric that we're looking at too in terms of engagement, right? And so for the different types of resources and activities, and because the whole PPP situation in Detroit, now that the second round is coming, is an access problem. And so how are we pushing information out so that the businesses that we're trying to target are actually engaging? And even though it's not an in-process measure, it's a E&D process metric, it's an in process metric of how are we engaging businesses? Who are they? How many of them are women? How many of them are minority? Who are we missing? Based on how these businesses define themselves. And so I think that's another metric that is important, which is more activity-based, but it's engagement.
Excellent. We have another submitted question. What advice would you give to those who serve as mediators between the public and the private sectors, working together to solve these challenges specifically related to the recovery?
I think one thing is, speaking in the language that each partner can understand. So the private sector, a lot of times they need to know, what is the business case, right? Now, for a lot of us, it's like, this is just the right thing to do. And sometimes it's the right thing to do, but it also makes good business sense. So if you can find, the way to speak to each partner in a language that is going to get through to them, it'll be incredibly helpful for the partnership. And then don't be afraid to ask. I mean, there are a lot of groups and companies that are willing to help, but no one has ever asked them. And so if you know that there is a gap in your community, just start talking to folks who are in leadership. And that can be at a large, Fortune 500 company, or it can be at a small business. Like, for instance, with the riots, there is going to be a lot of need for glass replacement. So what if you come up with a strategy to do bulk glass ordering from a small business, right? So now you've got business to your small business, and then you've also got, new glass for a broken storefront window. So it's going to take that type of collaborative, innovative thinking to move forward, but just don't be afraid to ask, and then speak in a language that each partner can understand.
Excellent, thank you. We have another question really focused on the impact of shortfalls, economic shortfall in small and rural communities. The question really is about how those municipalities that are suffering greatly themselves can work and bring those resources to help their small businesses survive over the short term.
I think there are a couple of things. One, I originally started talking about the CARES Act money a little bit. So in the state of Mississippi, they authorized a $300 million grant program from Mississippi for small businesses. And the money is going to go into two buckets. So the first bucket is $60 million in direct payments of $2,000 to eligible small businesses that closed down either forcibly or voluntarily due to COVID-related government orders. These businesses will be identified by the Mississippi Department of Revenue, and there's nothing that the business has to do to access this money. So in the second bucket is a $240 million grant program of $1,500 to $25,000 for eligible small businesses based on 2 months of eligible expenses. And so if you're in a small community, making the business owners aware of programs like this is going to be important. And then identifying community lenders that can help these small businesses get PPP loans. There are a lot of people who think for various reasons that they're not eligible, and they are. And I think if you can identify some resources to explain to the small businesses what it will take to apply for the various products that are available, that'll go a long way.
Well,
That's an incredible. Well, I was just going to reflect
please.
on that investment from Mississippi. I mean,
that's amazing.
I mean, it looks like, you know, everybody got allocations to deal with the economic displacement from COVID, but that is a very significant small business investment. I mean, that in terms of nationally. So it's really, I didn't know about that. I'm glad you raised it.
There's also a $40 million set aside.
Wow.
For minority businesses.
I was going to say that's a model worth replicating and understanding more. That's very impressive and progressive. Thanks for sharing that.
Well, this has been a phenomenal conversation. And I do want our attendees to know that we will do our best to address those unanswered questions in a follow-up email. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this important conversation. We are recording this session and we'll be sharing it with our attendees later. But I want to first thank the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program for their partnership in developing and helping us bring this to you. I'd like to thank our presenters, Joe Perilla of Brookings, Pam Lewis of the New Economy Initiative, and Kendra Key of HOPE. For more information about the work of Pluribus Unum and Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, please visit the web addresses on the screen. Thank you so much and have a wonderful afternoon.